Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Pitcher Partners client webinar on the evolving role of the modern CFO and the impacts on businesses in the middle market. I'm pleased to introduce Jyotika Rangel and Frank Russo, who are here with me today. Joe is a partner at Pitcher Partners in Sydney, who specialises in providing a range of clients from multinational corporations to family-owned businesses with outsourced CFO and accounting advisory services. And Frank is a partner with Pitcher Partners Melbourne, heading up the full scope finance team within our business advisory and assurance team. Frank is involved with business owners and CFOs on a daily basis, consulting on everything from reporting issues, performance measurement, financial analysis, strategic advisory, and general business and taxation advice. That's a mouthful. So hello to both of you, and thank you for taking the time to share your insights with us here today.
Thanks for having us, Gavin.
For those viewers, we will be using Slido. So hopefully on your screens, you should see a pop-up message inviting you to use Slido. All you need to do is click the open button. Throughout this webinar, if you do have any questions, please submit them on Slido and we'll get to them towards the end of the session. And we'll give it a bit of a crack now. So hopefully you can see your first question up on the screen once Slido's up and running. And the first question is, does your business have a dedicated CFO? And you've got a few options there to select from. So please take the time to select which options. Okay, that was interesting results. So we had, it was about 70%, I think, that said yes for a dedicated CFO, or 21%, which was another person dedicated in the finance function. I think that's pretty consistent with what we would see in our client base, Joe and Frank.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
Yes, definitely.
In the radar report, the research that did come back, it was slightly lower than that, so it was about 57%. So it looks like we've got a bit more concentration in our audience here today. Okay, well, let's jump into it. Our latest radar report paints a vivid picture on the pressures of middle market CFOs and what they're under. From AI adoption to workforce change and capital constraints. So they're venturing outside the normal finance domain that CFOs typically would have been focusing on. Before we get into the specifics, can each of you share what you're seeing on the ground and maybe what is the single biggest shift that you've noticed in how CFOs are approaching their role, even compared to the last 2 or 3 years? I might start with you, Joe.
Yeah, sure. And certainly in my experience with working with businesses that have a CFO, a dedicated CFO, and also in my own experience as being an outsourced CFO, I think the single biggest shift I have seen is that broadening of the remit of what a CFO is required to be doing. Historically, CFOs have very much been the owner and controller of the financials, so cash flow, reporting, forecasting, budgeting, and so on. And sure, that is still very much a requirement of CFOs. But increasingly, I'm seeing CFOs being asked to do a lot of areas that are not necessarily in their skill set. So some of the things you mentioned, technology, AI, ESG is certainly an area that's becoming a focus that's landing on the CFO's desk. So yeah, certainly seeing a lot of that shift happening for CFOs. And increasingly, as they become the bridge to different parts of the business, operations and sales, they're being more and more involved in the strategy setting of the business. So yeah, I think the broadening is the shift I'm seeing.
Definitely there, yeah. Thank you. Frank, have you got anything, I guess, in addition to what Joe has mentioned?
Joe's covered it very well, but very, very similar in my client base. I think the CFO is becoming more of a coordinator of key areas, whether it's ESG, reporting. It's not just about getting the numbers right anymore. It is a much wider remit, and as we tabled it in our radar report, the Chief Figure Out Officer.
I guess that's going to put quite a lot of pressure on the finance team and the makeup of the finance team. And the skills required of a finance team are shifting quite rapidly. You've mentioned data, I guess data literacy, Commercial acumen is always a strong requirement for a CFO, tech fluency. But middle market businesses can't always compete just on salary alone to attract the right talent within the business. And there's always those commercial constraints that they need to work through. Frank, one for you. How do businesses build a future-ready finance team when you're working with a real-world constraint in terms of budget and headcount?
Yeah, I think it's being very clear on what your strategy is and identifying what the capability gaps are, and then looking for those roles. You don't necessarily need to bring in specialists to fulfill all those roles. An outsourcing hybrid model can work, especially in specialist areas. I think you need to be pragmatic. Again, align it to strategy and ensure your capability is achieving those goals.
I guess there's always that trade-off, tight budgets, and even today, I guess in the current economic market, it is a bit harder to just throw extra cash at things these days. Are you seeing anything different in your client bases? That's one for either of you.
Yeah, I think in terms of my client base, it's really honing in on what the business actually requires and picking your battles or picking where you need to spend your money, increasing costs everywhere, whether it's taxes or labour or whatever it may be. So what I'm seeing is a lot more clients thinking carefully about their spend and really honing in on what does the business actually require and what are we going to get out of it.
And I think also giving the internal finance team the opportunity to upskill in certain areas as well. So they may have a specialisation or an interest area. It's really taking advantage of that and allowing people to develop in those areas as well.
Excellent. We've got another Slido question that's coming up now. AI is a big part of, I guess, the world today. So hopefully that question's showing up. So are you leveraging AI as part of your finance or broader business functions? So if the audience can take a little bit of time just to respond to that, please. Thanks, everyone. We've got a big response rate in terms of the finance functions. So AI is definitely being rolled out in the finance functions for our client base, which is interesting, and in IT and data management a close second. But yeah, certainly the finance functions the big one. And AI has definitely been front of mind within Pitcher Partners, but also within our client base, and we've had a previous radar research on that before. And the current report did highlight that while there's a high awareness of AI, meaningful implementation in finance functions is still patchy. CFOs are being told that they need to lead on AI, but many of them didn't sign up to be technologists. Joe, if I can ask this one of you, where do you think the responsibility for those skills actually sits, and how do you get started with without making expensive mistakes in this area?
Yeah, really good question. And I think you're right. CFOs do often feel that pressure to be technologists. But certainly I think there needs to be clarity that a CFO doesn't necessarily have the skill set to know all there is to know about technology. There isn't that expectation that they're programmers or coders and have all the intricate details of software. But I think what is important for a CFO to know and to be across is their full finance function, and to know the areas where there are inefficiencies, there are potentially manual processes or repetitive tasks. And I think they're the areas that a CFO can really hone in on in terms of implementing automation, technology, and AI. And I think that's not been new in the finance industry, in the accounting space. There are a lot of off-the-shelf products. For a CFO that's perhaps not been experienced in implementing any sort of technological change, I think it's really important to start small, start on those that are low-hanging fruit in an area that is controllable, is manageable. And I think once you do that implementation quite successfully, it just builds that confidence for not only the CFO, but the team to then move on to other projects. I think where we see costly mistakes being made is when there's too much trying to do too much all at once. So wholesale sort of technology changes, I think it can get quite challenging. You have consultants in there, you have project managers, all whilst the finance team is trying to deliver BAU, trying to implement, trying to do tandem sort of parallel runs. And I think that's where it gets challenging.
And I guess sort of what you were alluding to there was that the CFOs really should be acting as the AI sponsors for the organisation rather than the AI implementers or doers, which sort of makes sense given the skill set of CFOs generally. Although some I have certainly seen have a bent towards that area and do like to get in amongst the weeds, as they say. And I guess further on the AI train, we've heard a lot about, I guess, employees fearing the implementation of AI and that it might replace them in their role. But finance teams also face a lot more immediate pressure, the expectation to do more with the same headcount. So how should CFOs be honest with their teams about what's changing without creating anxiety that drives the best people out the door?
And I think it's important to understand with any change management, including technology, people is obviously a key part of the success of that new implementation and change. Anxiety comes from a place of uncertainty and a lack of clarity. So I think that's where the CFO has to be very honest and deliberate in making sure all team members are involved in the process of implementing any particular change, including identifying what that problem area is, making sure that the staff actually agree that it's a problem area, because there's nothing worse than trying to fix a problem that someone else doesn't see as a problem. And just taking them along on the journey of how we've chosen a particular product or a software to try and solve the solution. So perhaps it's the team sitting in on demos, getting their feedback, helping them be involved in the process of identifying that solution. And then being really clear on what the success outcomes are. So oftentimes it is a saving of time for a particular staff member, but it's also equally important to know what is the plan to do with that excess capacity that's perhaps been created for that staff member. And I think it's in those instances where we need to be providing a pathway forward, whether it's upskilling someone, allowing them to provide more value-add services, which also contributes to their own job satisfaction.
Yeah, so I guess a bit more clarity, isn't it? So that everyone knows the direction that's being headed. It's quite an interesting space, and there's a lot of pressure, I guess, to bring in efficiencies within an organisation. And we do hear lots of stories about, I guess, the impact that AI is having. Some of those stories are a bit embellished, but some of them are quite powerful in terms of what they've been able to be done in terms of internal administration and processes and cutting down time and waste. And I guess that sort of brings us to a little bit of the governance side of things. This is not going to all be about AI too, by the way. But governance, in terms of the tension between, I guess, moving fast in adopting AI, because there is that external pressure that all organisations are feeling, but also whilst doing that, but maintaining controls and risk frameworks so that the finance functions are built on a solid foundation. I guess for you, Frank, in practice, how are CFOs threading that needle, and what does good enough governance look like when you're still learning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's evolving. So, as Joe said, you need to jump in and give it a go, and it's probably clear that you need to have a policy around it. How to use, what to use. There might be certain tools, programs that the organisations are okay to use. So whether it's Copilot or Claude or there's lots out there, but being very clear on that. And I think continuous improvement So give it a go. Is it working? But have a monitoring mechanism to ensure that you're actually getting what your intention was at the start out of it. But I think it's clear if you don't embrace it, you're going to get left behind. So you need to start somewhere, and if you haven't started, it's not too late, but get on board. And we're seeing that with our own staff giving it a go. There's some staff that use it religiously for everything they do, and then there's others that are probably late adopters that are getting there. Having clear boundaries is important.
Yep. Joe, do you have anything to add?
Oh, no, I'm just reiterating what Frank said. I think building the governance and allowing the people to experiment and use the tools, I think they do have to go in tandem and parallel, and one informs the other. Don't let perfect get in the way of good.
Yeah, and we always talk about better governance, so just continuing to improve rather than going for number one at the start. As long as you've got that continuous improvement, I think you'll be okay.
Yeah, and AI is obviously broad. Got broad applications within an organisation. So it's not only the finance function, which the CFO probably does have that control over the framework and being able to put in the governance and the boundaries, but when it is sort of applied to other functions within the organisation, I guess it's important for the CFO to sort of be communicating with those other heads of different departments to help put in place some frameworks. The CFO typically is across governance frameworks, more so than other areas. So that's another important part.
Yeah, I've seen it in one of my clients where they've used it for sales, lead generation, reviewing trends and historical data to set future sales, which has been really interesting. But the CFO's sat across that, which is good from an overall governance and bringing it all together.
Excellent. We'll just change tack a little bit now. So we might just go to the audience again with another Slido question. So if you have considered outsource support for your business, which functions have you considered? Okay, so HR and personnel management seems to be the most, data and IT as well, and some marketing. And then finance coming in at the bottom. So that's quite interesting. What we did see, I guess, in our radar research this last time was there is, I guess, a bit of momentum or a trend towards either outsourced or fractional CFO usage. I guess when considering the responsibilities within a team, a common theme throughout the report is that while responsibilities of a CFO are growing, there can be an understandable gap in the specialist skill sets that are required, and we've talked about all those different areas earlier in this webinar. So there's digital, AI, ESG, governance, risk management, all those type of things. I'll hand this one to you, Frank. Are you seeing CFOs outsource more specialist functions, or is the trend moving back towards building in-house capability in these areas?
So what I'm seeing is definitely the core accounting and day-to-day management is internal, but a lot more of the specialist requirements being outsourced, whether that's ESG or I've had clients in the past that have completed an acquisition, so helping with the integration of that, or a new system that they've implemented, so helping with that transformation from an existing system to a new system. I think outsourcing works really well when you need to scale up and don't necessarily need the full-time resource, and definitely see clients doing that from time to time, whether that's around financial reporting. They might have an audit deadline, or they're getting ready for a sale. They don't necessarily need the full-time equivalent, but they're happy to invest that time to get deadlines completed. And we're definitely seeing a lot more of that.
Is that consistent with what you're saying as well, Joe?
Yeah, definitely. I think clients are generally, where there's a skills gap or there's a resourcing gap, that's generally where they look to outsource. And I think in my client base, I'm seeing a lot more of that hybrid sort of model where there is an in-house team, but equally there's an outsourced part of the team, and they're very much part of the organisation's team.
Yeah, working together
Yeah.
in concert, isn't it?
Yes.
CFOs are generally sort of in the lucky or privileged position where they get to have quite a rich view of what is happening within a business, but translating that into a compelling narrative for the board or investors is a skill in itself. Frank, in your experience, how do CFOs move from reporting on numbers to actually shaping the strategic conversations in the room?
Yeah, I think it's a given that the numbers are correct. The board wants accurate numbers, so it's no longer just about reporting on the numbers. I think it's getting underneath and understanding what are the key drivers, what are the numbers actually telling us, and do they align to some of the strategic objectives. So yeah, I think it's more about analysing and getting ready for the future. Boards want to know where they're heading and what are the numbers saying about that.
Yeah. There's probably a bit of storytelling involved in that aspect. Sometimes I guess the information that CFOs are privy to can be quite detailed, a little bit of complexity as well. So I think moving through that, creating a bit of a simple narrative that can be easily understood by everyone's really important. So that communication skills, sort of a growing requirement for CFOs. Yeah. Probably just move a little bit now towards, I guess, the current economic environment where we do have, I guess, high interest rates potentially going higher. Growth is becoming harder to find for organisations, and definitely it's becoming a bit more expensive to fund if you're trying to build out a growth pipeline. Middle market businesses are making harder calls about where to invest. And from both of your perspectives, I guess what framework do you use or recommend to help a CFO or an owner manager prioritise capital allocations when everything is required and urgent? Jo?
Yeah. And many businesses grapple with this because there are always projects that are looking to get off the ground and they all need funding and they're all, according to any particular area, just as priority as anything else. So I think, the CFO has to be at the forefront of trying to help the board or the founders determine where they do allocate funding. I think a really good way to start doing that is for the CFO to really understand each of those project areas, understand whether they align with the broader business strategy. I think that's quite key. If it doesn't, then perhaps it shouldn't be a priority. And then where you still have a number of projects that do align with the broader strategy, it's really then for the CFO to, again, be able to come to the board with what are the costs of implementation, what are the benefits of implementation, and just as important, what are the opportunity costs of not implementing something. So I think coming to the board with that sort of analytics, a bit of a story and context behind all of that helps with the decision-making process. Increasingly, we're seeing CFOs need to be able to say no to something and it be just as important as being able to say yes when it comes to funding.
Can't always be easy when you've got a lot of demands coming at you. Is that certainly your experience as well, Frank?
Yeah, definitely. And just to add to that, I think, as Jo said, it's okay to say no, but it's also about prioritising. We're in a market where potentially you won't be able to fund every project that you initially started off to. So I would start with where you're going to get the best bang for your buck. Prioritise the projects and start with the top.
Yeah. Excellent. Now, ESG has sort of come up a few times in responses today, but also when we're out there conducting the research. So these reporting requirements are, I guess, tightening, but also in terms of the reach and the number of organisations that now fall within the reporting regime is growing. And what I'm certainly seeing is that the responsibility for that reporting is falling primarily with the CFO to control and bring together. but we're also seeing that some businesses are using sustainability as a general value driver within the business. Joe, if a middle market CFO is struggling to meet the compliance obligations, how do they start thinking about ESG in a more positive light and beyond a sort of a regulation burden?
And that's a tricky one, because oftentimes when there is new regulation introduced, it can feel like a compliance burden, and certainly there's time and resources and costs that need to go into place to be able to do the reporting. I think it's really important for businesses and for CFOs to understand what is the purpose of this reporting, and in terms of mandatory climate reporting, the idea is for businesses to understand what their carbon emissions are and then over time how to reduce those. Now, that carbon emissions can be quite an abstract concept for business owners. So it's, again, the CFO to have that ability to translate that into language that makes sense for the business. Oftentimes, to reduce carbon emissions, you need to do a full process review of your business, and that can have benefits such as cost savings. So now suddenly we're talking about things that business owners understand. So we're talking about the profitability of the business that goes to the bottom line. So these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think it's important to try and get as Frank said before, get the biggest bang for your buck. If you're going to have to report, let's make the most of it. Let's make this an investment where we can actually see a return. There are also other areas where businesses benefit from doing ESG reporting, reputational benefits, brand benefits. All things being equal, a consumer will choose a sustainable product or a service or a business over one that's not. In the recruitment market, younger generations want to be working for businesses that have purpose, that have ESG as part of their value proposition, as opposed to one that doesn't. So I think ESG is increasingly becoming an important part of business strategy. And I think businesses that don't incorporate ESG are not doing it to their own detriment.
Yep. No, it's certainly, I think, a growing trend as well. Once was seen as something being, I guess, thrown upon the business, whether that's the business owners or the CFO or whoever might be tasked with that responsibility. But more and more, it's starting to be seen as an opportunity for the business. We've got lots of questions coming in, everyone, so thank you very much for that. If you do have any that are on your mind, please put them in Slido, and we will have time to get to them shortly. I guess before we sort of do get to the viewer questions, is there any last sort of comments that you'd like to share with the audience today? Frank, we might just start with you.
Yeah, I think for a CFO, it's you're being charged with a lot. So being very clear on what your accountability is, getting the right team together, whether that's a hybrid model or getting the skill set in, especially around some of those specialist areas, whether it's data and AI or ESG, or if you're doing an acquisition. I think it's really important to do that. In my mind, the CFO is more of a coordinator. Yes, you need to be across the numbers, but you also need to be across the whole business and bringing all the various parts together.
And Joe, yourself, any?
Yeah, I mean, the only other area that I'd add, and something you touched on, Gavin, is CFOs are increasingly needing to have not just all those technical skills, but those real people skills, the soft skills perhaps, really great communication, really good emotional intelligence, being able to manage different stakeholder priorities and competing interests. So yeah, some of those skills that perhaps a CFO didn't used to have in the past, they're often stereotyped as very analytical people, very introverted people. I think we're increasingly seeing the need for those people skills in CFOs.
Yep. And certainly AI can't take those skills away, can they? So thank you very much. We'll move to the viewer questions now. So the first one is, we are seeing, where are we seeing the greatest gains, or where are you seeing the greatest gains in efficiency in the accounting space from automation? So maybe Frank, do you want to?
Yeah, definitely around some of that processing, whether it's AR or AP. You know, this is not new, but around bank feeds, a lot of that processing and bookkeeping that once was manual is now automated to a certain extent. And to where we sort of got to earlier, it's redefining the role of that bookkeeper in AR and AP. It might be chasing debtors, bringing down the collection period, whether it's 50 days or 40 days, maybe it's 30 days, depending on what your terms of trade are. But there's definitely in that AR and AP space, I'm seeing it for sure.
Yeah. And Joe?
Yeah, and I think slowly it's moving into some of that analytical type of area as well. And I think that's really great in consolidations and so forth. I think that's important to allow the CFO to not have to do all of that grunt work themselves, but now be able to interpret what that information is telling them for the broader business.
Yeah, I've seen a few examples in addition to those as well, just in the area of repetitive tasks. So you can actually set up AI agents. Internally here we use Copilot, but that agent, you can actually set a few steps for it to do, and it automatically does it. So I've seen that with formatting, for example, of spreadsheets, which is a similar, a small sort of step, but it can break it apart, can actually pull specific data sets and put it in a specific place. And there's a few other examples like that as well. So I think once you start playing around with AI, especially agents, I think they're quite powerful. You'll realise that there's quite a lot of areas within a finance function that can be automated.
So then the skill set is in actually understanding what the numbers are saying. To be able to utilise that to your benefit.
And understanding the process as well to build that agent to do that. Yep. Another one from the audience. We've got. This one's a bit specialist. It's probably for you, Frank, this one. But what role, if any, does a CFO play in commercial property insurance placement and determination of values at risk?
It's a very interesting question, and it's probably one where you need to outsource to an insurance broker if you're not already. Having a really good insurance broker on your side that analyses your insurances is key. Whether you're underinsured or overinsured, sometimes there could be savings in that whole process. It's not really one for me per se.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it really highlights the broader point where something that's quite nuanced and niche falls onto the CFO to be able to respond to. But again, it makes sense because they're the ones that are privy to some of this information, but they don't have the expertise in insurance or valuations, for example. But so I think it just goes to prove the broader point.
And it's often in the storytelling, the CFO, around the risk that might be associated with a particular property that can help steer insurance broker.
Yep. No, thank you. Getting quite a few questions coming through regarding AI. So the next one is, what areas do you believe that AI will not be successful? Maybe Joe first this time.
Certainly, I think being able to interpret the data in a way that makes sense for decision makers to understand. I think AI can get you to a certain point in terms of providing analytics and financials and data. But I think being able to actually storytell and what does that mean for our business, for our strategy and where to from here, I think those are human elements that really I don't see AI replacing anytime soon.
Yeah, I agree with Joe. I think AI will get the data for you to make better and informed decisions, but having that human element to strategise and compare different strategies, I think will continue.
Yeah, I think intuition as well. CFOs, business owners, business leaders, they're successful not only because of their technical skills, but also just their gut feel or their intuition, and that's a hard thing, I guess, to code up into an AI program.
Yeah, and I think just the experiences like that you've been through over your career, and like you said, whether it's involvement of the board, the CEO, CFO, or even staff members, bringing that all together and strategising, I think will continue.
Next one, what are the biggest mistakes you see CFOs make when trying to broaden their remit beyond finance? Frank?
I think when you try to take on too much and try to be a specialist in an area that you don't have the expertise in, I think you start off from a good point and wanting to understand and get under the covers and understand the issue. But I think where you can fall down is where you don't reach out for that specialist advice. And sometimes that specialist advice is just bridging the gap to you until your knowledge increases. Definitely what I'm sort of seeing.
Well, sometimes it's a case of you don't know what you don't know as well. So, I think it's important, no matter what role you're in, that you do seek that advice and assistance when there's something outside your wheelhouse. Another question coming through. Please keep firing these questions through. There are quite a lot, which is great to see. What skills or capabilities are becoming non-negotiable for a modern CFO, particularly in organisations that don't have deep internal resources? Jo?
Yeah, I think similar to what I said before, there's obviously technical skills that a CFO needs to have, financially literate, data literate, have an awareness of technology. But equally, those good communication skills, emotional intelligence, really good commercial acumen and commercial judgment. I think they're the non-negotiables that a modern CFO needs to be able to develop and have.
This is a question not from the audience, actually from me. But I guess in our recent report, it did talk about, succession risk in terms of the role now that the CFO is playing, where they are wearing many different hats and covering many different aspects of an organisation. And you start to develop quite deep and ingrained knowledge of the organisation, and you do become quite critical in terms of the decision-making process within the organisation. I guess one for you, Frank. What sort of risk do you see that sort of bringing into a business, and how might that be mitigated?
Yeah, I think it's key person risk is the obvious one, where everything's in one person's head. I think a good CFO will involve various people from around the business in whatever task that they're doing or whatever area they're looking at. And by doing that, you are providing that succession. So if something does happen, there is someone who at least is aware of a conversation or a discussion that you've had, or whatever the issue may be. I think the more people you can involve, the better from that perspective.
I guess that's a challenge, isn't it? Particularly with many mid-market businesses, because you can't have a big team covering all different aspects.
Yeah, and it's one where outsourcing can actually play a role. I've got clients where we are the longest standing employee, and we sort of do carry some of that corporate knowledge through.
Thank you. Another one. Oh, this one's a difficult one, but so I guess for many mid-market businesses are family run businesses, and if they're transitioning to a more formal governance structure, how can the CFO provide assistance with that structure without disrupting the culture of the organisation? Jo?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a challenging one, and it's any organisation that's growing will have those sort of challenges. How do we build more governance and structure and process and controls? I think it's natural for the CFO to lead some of that, because oftentimes the finance function for even a family business will be the one that's the most well governed, has the best processes in place just by the virtue of and the nature of what it is that the finance team does. I think it's important that the CFO helps with the governance in a a way that fits the size of the organisation. So founders and family businesses often make decisions based on gut feel, based on their experiences. And I think it's important that CFOs slowly start putting in some process around that, providing data that supports some of that decision making. And I think that's the only way to do it, is just incremental, slow sort of movements towards a more structured process.
Yep. I guess any time in a family business as well that you're trying to put in some formal structures and governance, and if you've got multiple generations working in the business, trust plays an important role. And I think oftentimes the CFO is in that position of trust with the business owner and the family members. So I think a CFO is quite critical in establishing a strong, sound governance framework for middle market businesses.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Middle market businesses or family businesses, the entrepreneurship of what they've done to date has been successful, and you don't want to discourage businesses from continuing to do that. So having governance that's fit for purpose is really important. And we talk about better governance, so just continue to evolve and improve.
Thank you. We've got another AI-focused question. With the movement to AI, do you expect the number of finance roles to reduce? And if so, by what percentage? Jo?
I can't give you a percentage. And I don't necessarily think full roles will reduce. I do think parts of roles will become easier. So certainly those roles, and Frank, you spoke to those earlier, the bookkeeping, so the transactional, very repetitive type parts of finance functions, I think certainly are already automated to a large degree. So I think it's parts of roles will certainly disappear, but there will be capacity to then do some more value add and more interesting deliverables for the finance team.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's really a bit of watch this space, I think, how that progresses. Great questions coming through, everyone. Thank you. What's the best way for middle market CFOs to upskill so they can support areas like data analytics, technology, governance, and ESG? We sort of covered a little bit of that throughout the presentation, but Frank, anything to add to that?
I think just surrounding yourself with the specialists as and when required. Take ESG as an example. There are a number of specialist firms out there that are supporting CFOs at the moment. I know we work with a couple of firms that help support our clients, and what I'm seeing with that is that clients are learning and upskilling their own staff, that eventually the specialists will fall away and they'll have that internal capability. So it's a good way to invest in the future without sort of spending all that money up front.
And I think CFOs, it's important that CFOs also connect with other CFOs in other organisations. Any C-suite executive, it can be a very lonely role to be in, because oftentimes you are the only one in that position in that organisation. So I think having a broader network of similar people to bounce things off of, have sounding boards, and having a really great relationship with your accountant or your advisor, I think that's where you can get the learnings and upskill in areas that you may not necessarily be skilled in.
Yeah. I think that's very important, the networking aspect of the role. So if you ever have an opportunity to attend, whether it's your accountant or advisor's networking function, but there'll be others, whether it's a director function or an industry-specific function. It's important to attend and meet other people and hear what they're going through and obviously learn from each other. Yep. If you had to prioritise 3 actions for a CFO wanting to modernise their function in the next 12 months, what would they be? Frank?
So I think, as we sort of alluded to earlier, identifying those tasks or items that can be automated, looking for efficiencies within your finance team or within your broader remit, whether that's sales or within the actual finance and accounting function. So yeah, investing in AI, definitely having a think about the capability gaps that you've got in your team and investing accordingly. And Joe's sort of spoke on this earlier, to be that chief figure out officer. I think that communication and soft skills is really important as well. Being able to coordinate all the key stakeholders will be an element of your role. If it's not already, that will be increasing.
Yep. And Joe, so for you?
Yeah, similar. And I think certainly doing a full process review of the finance function is important. And getting perhaps a second opinion or an outsider's perspective on the finance function is also important, especially if a CFO's been in the business for quite some time. It's hard to step away and look at things objectively. So yeah, I think it helps to do a full review and identify those areas that Frank spoke to as well.
I think also just, I think it was you, Joe, that mentioned it earlier, which is making sure that everything's linked back to the strategy of the organisation. And often if you step back and just think, okay, where are we heading? Maybe that can guide you to focus on particular areas that you might need to focus on. I guess uplifting in the finance function and the CFO function in that way. Final question has come through, which is excellent. We're doing really well on time as well. So, how can CFOs better partner with CEOs and boards to drive growth rather than being seen primarily as cost managers? Joe.
I think this is a case of where a CEO and a CFO need to have a great working relationship. It's really important that they both see the value that each is bringing to the table. And again, it goes back to the CFO being able to really communicate and explain whatever it is that they're trying to deliver to the board or the CEO in terms of being able to allow better decision making. As we've spoken quite a bit about, the CFO's remit's expanded so much more than just managing cost and compliance. So yeah, I think it goes back to having that ability to communicate that, and for the CEO and CFO to have a great working relationship.
Frank, did you have anything to tip in?
Yeah, no, I think the CEO and CFO need to work hand in hand. And as I said earlier, the CFO is not just about reporting the numbers. It's what are the drivers and what's the information actually telling us, and then working with the CEO to communicate that to the board and hopefully align that to the strategy and their growth.
Yep. Excellent. Well, we've run out of viewer questions, so that'll bring us to the end of today's webinar. Joe and Frank, thank you very much for your time and all your insights today. I'm sure everyone's got something valuable out of this discussion. And for everyone watching, thank you very much for your time. We do have further information on our recent radar report, which is on the Modern CFO, which is on our website, so please check that out if you haven't already. There's a podcast as well with Frank starring in that. So please make sure you have a listen to that, and you can access that through our website as well. Thank you very much for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.